Hi, I'm Jen from Tea Leaves and Tweed, and welcome to something a little bit different. Like many of you, I've been at home a lot more often recently, and when I'm at home, especially if I'm a little bit stressed, I like to bake. So I asked on Instagram, and people seem to be interested in seeing what I'm baking. So I thought today I would share with you my recipe for scones, or scones. I have a British expat friend who would be mortified if I called them anything but scones. So this is my recipe, which is based on a recipe from Mary Berry with a few little tweaks of my own for a batch of scones to enjoy with your tea. So let's bake. Here I have my baking setup. I like to keep my personal recipes in a small journal, and I have my pen with me to make notes if I decide that there are any changes I need to make to the recipe. Like I said, this is based on a recipe from Mary Berry, but over the years I've come up with my own tweaks to make it my own. So first, we're going to start with our dry ingredients. Now, like many British recipes, Mary Berry's Devonshire scones recipe starts with self-raising flour. And of course, self-raising flour is not a very common ingredient in American households. So I'm using regular flour. And then that is regular all-purpose flour. And that is 1 3/4 cups of regular all-purpose flour, half a teaspoon of salt, and a tablespoon of baking powder. And then the recipe also calls for 2 tablespoons of sugar. I'm using 2 tablespoons of sugar, just regular granulated sugar. And you'll give that a little mix together. Just to kind of aerate everything and get everything mixed together before you add the butter. So now I'm going to take my 4 tablespoons of unsalted butter and just cut it into 4 pieces so I can add it. And actually, sometimes I like to cut these in half. So I'm going to cut these into 8 pieces. And now these I'm just going to put into my flour mixture. And just pinch them together until the flour is kind of rubbed into the butter and the butter is rubbed into the flour. And you just kind of break up the bigger clumps to start with and you toss it with flour. And I like to just toss them together every so often so that the butter is always covered in flour mixture, because that just keeps it from sticking as much to your fingers. And of course your hands will get covered in flour. And the idea behind scones is it's very similar to what Americans call biscuits, is that you want bits of cold solid butter kind of distributed amongst the dough so that as they melt and the steam in them, the water in them turns to steam and expands, it creates all those beautiful flaky layers. So now we have our butter rubbed into our flour. So now we're going to mix together our wet ingredients. And there's really only 2 of them. We have an egg, and I use heavy cream in my scones. And this is because the recipe that my mother made for me when I was growing up and we had afternoon tea were cream scones. So I like my scones to be made with cream. And this is of course some cream that I got from the same place where I get my milk. And it has a fair amount of fat floating on the top, which is wonderful for later, but it's not really, we don't really want blobs. Oh, there's 1 blob. So this is a 1/2 cup of heavy cream. And 1 large egg. And I'm just gonna beat this together with a fork. You can also add some vanilla if you want, or some lemon extract is delicious, or even some lemon zest. You could probably even add a little lemon juice if you wanted lemon scones. And obviously if you wanted to add dried fruit, you would mix that in with the flour. But these are just going to be plain cream scones. So now we take our wet ingredients and we mix them in to our dry ingredients to form a dough. And you'll just kind of mix everything together. I will sometimes keep my cream close by if I feel like it needs a little bit more liquid. But it is a bit of a stiff dough. And while you don't want to overwork the dough, you do have to make sure it's mixed together. So once I've gotten it roughly mixed together, I do go in with my hands. And luckily, we've all gotten very good at keeping our hands scrupulously clean these days. So I just kind of squeeze that together and turn it over a few times until it starts to come together into a nice dough. And then you want to put it out on your clean work surface. And this is actually a dry enough dough that I don't really feel the need to add any additional flour because you're not really kneading this like you would bread. All I do is I pat it out to a nice rectangle. And then one way that I try to encourage it to have some nice flaky layers, and I do this with my biscuits as well, is I fold it 3 times and then again in half. And then just pat that out again to about 2 centimeters thick. Maybe more like 1.5 centimeters. So. You can see, that's not sticking at all. And then I have a whiskey glass to cut them out because I do not own a cookie cutter, or at least not a circular cookie cutter. And you just cut out some nice rounds. And you can, of course, re-roll your scraps. So now I have my scones cut out and on a piece of baking parchment on my baking sheet. I'm going to pour out a little bit of my cream and just dab a little bit of cream on the top of each scone. This is an optional step. I actually don't put anything on top of my scones much of the time. But this is just a little extra fancy thing because I think we could all use a little extra fancy treat right now. And I use my finger. You could use a pastry brush, but my pastry brush is quite old and is shedding bristles like crazy. And then just to dress these up a little bit, I have some lavender colored sugar. So I can just put a little bit of lavender sugar on top of the scones for a little color and a little sparkle, just as a fancy little decorative touch for a stressful week. And you can also cut these scones just into wedges, just bring it into a oval like I did and then cut it into wedges instead of making little circles. So now these are going to go into the oven at 425 degrees Fahrenheit for about 10 minutes. So now I have my fresh scone. I can split it down the middle. You can see how beautifully that comes apart. And I'm going to use a little bit of blackberry jam. And you can just melt some butter on these scones and it is delicious, and have butter and jam on your scones. But again, I wanted to have a bit of a treat. And since I can't go out to the store to buy Devonshire cream, I'm using the next best thing, which is some of this lovely fresh cream that I have whipped until it is very, very nearly butter, but not quite. So I have some very thickly beaten, unsweetened cream that I'm going to dollop on top of the jam. And I think we should have some tea with our scones. This is the end of a shanpuer that I've been drinking most of the day. And while I don't usually eat with the beginnings of a tea session, once I've steeped the tea out, especially with a shanpuer, I sometimes feel like I need a little something to eat because the tea is starting to affect me. And by the time I get to the later steepings, I have an idea of what the tea is going to do, and I don't worry about deadening any of the flavors. And if I have something like a shanpuer that is a little bit bitter or astringent, sometimes something a little bit rich, like these scones, can really help with that. So now I have my tea and my scones. These are one of my favorite treats. I have been eating tea and scones since I was probably 5 years old or younger. It's just such a lovely little way to break up the afternoon. So I hope you enjoyed this baking treat, and definitely let me know if you give the recipe a try. I'll post my full recipe down below. And remember, with all recipes, things may take a little longer, you may need a little more or less cream. Adjust things as you need and adjust things to your taste. Thank you for joining me. Happy steeping and happy baking. And I hope I see you again sometime. Bye.